Hello and welcome to this webinar for Year 8 Narrative Writing or Story Writing. There are three key learning aims, three key takeaways. Firstly, how to decide on the purpose of your narrative writing. Secondly, revising indirect characterization and looking at the unreliable narrator. And then finally, understanding the 5-point narrative arc. This is all for a specific narrative writing assignment. Write a story that involves a detective. Now, first of all, let's think about the purpose of narrative writing. Now, there are three key purposes and each of them are valid, and you need to decide as a writer what you want your story to do as your reader reads. So the first purpose, A, would be to excite and thrill and entertain your readers. Now, there's nothing wrong with that. To make an exciting story that is really thrilling and engaging, and readers want to read every sentence and they're hungry for more, is a very good purpose. However, you may want to have a slightly different purpose. You may want your story to be a bit unsettling and disturbing. You may want your readers to be a little bit upset or disquieted and unnerved, something that's terrifying and horrific even. And that again is a valid and credible purpose for your narrative writing. Or you might want to use your story to present and explore serious issues. So you might want to look at prejudice and inequality and look at some social and moral or even philosophical issues through your story. And each of these purposes are valid. However, as a writer, you need to make sure that you know and you've decided on the purpose of your own story. So, for example, let's have a story that wants to thrill and entertain and excite readers that involves a detective. So you may well have a story where a detective solves a crime and is able to arrest a villain. So that's exciting and thrilling because there'll be chases and there'll be all sorts of issues and problems and complications along the way that readers will enjoy. However, you might want something that's a bit more unsettling and a bit more disturbing. So perhaps the detective has their own apartment burgled. And so you're creating that sense of terror and fear and anxiety for your readers. Or you may well have a story where a detective experiences prejudice. So you're looking at a serious issue through your narrative. It's up to you, but you need to make that decision before you start writing. Ideally, you could have a story that does all three. That part of your story is really exciting and thrilling and entertaining, but other parts of your story are quite unsettling and frightening. And then throughout you're exploring serious issues because that's what stories do. That's what literature does. But deciding on one rather than trying to incorporate all three is absolutely fine. So let's think about indirect characterization. This is very important. We can't skip this. So for story writing and even for descriptive writing, indirect characterization or show don't tell is a very important technique to use, because instead of just blurting something out and just telling and just stating it, you're really showing, you're really describing, giving detail, helping readers to really visualize that character or that event. So the examples there, instead of just saying she felt incredibly nervous, you would show trembling hands and the whole body quivering. So for this particular assignment about a detective that is involved in this story, you might have some kind of villain, some kind of criminal, and the criminal is really evil. It's just really, really horrible. And you want to create a villain that's evil, it's very thrilling then and exciting and entertaining and engaging for your readers to see when this criminal is caught. But instead of just stating and telling readers that the villain was evil, you could describe and really show in detail. You might talk about the villain holding a sinister weapon in their left hand, and he enjoyed tormenting victims with this, and he wore a foreboding frown on his menacing forehead, and a skull ring wrapped around his middle finger, and he had a frightening necklace that sat around his ominously wrinkled throat, and the necklace was made of human teeth. You can see this is an evil character. He carries a weapon around with him. He enjoys torturing victims. He's got a necklace made of human teeth. He's got a wrinkled neck and this fierce frown and a skull ring. He's evil, but you haven't just told us. You've really shown your readers, you've really described in detail. What about the second idea of the story where the detective goes to the apartment and it's very frightening and disturbing? Well, the apartment seemed scary to the detective, is what you could tell. You would obviously avoid that word scary because it's not formal enough or descriptive enough for narrative writing for year 8. So instead, you could show how frightening the detective found the apartment. You could show how terrifying the apartment was. So you could say something like, dark shadows swamped the room, making the detective shiver. His knees knocked as the breeze blew to unsettle the silk curtains, and his stomach lurched as the obsidian shadows shook in the wind. So can you see that around him are all these shadows, and it's breezy, and his knees are knocking, his stomach's lurching, and he feels that the shadows are moving in the wind. You can see his terror, you can see his fear. And the fact that you mentioned silk curtains, again, is indirect characterization, showing that someone who likes expensive things, or perhaps who's very wealthy, has an expensive taste. It's a subtle, indirect characterization. What about for the last one, about the last story idea, where the detective faces prejudice? Well, you could say that the detective was angry, and that's valid because if you face prejudice and injustice, it would make you angry, but that's just telling. That's explicit and a bit simple and a bit boring for year 8 narrative writing. So instead, you could say she banged her fist against the desk before kicking its leg. As she stomped out of the crowded room, she smashed the door behind her with a splintering crack. You can see how angry she is. She's smashing the desk, kicking the desk, smashing the door, splintering and cracking it with the force of her rage. So this is much more effective, and it's showing that character, that someone who's really forceful and powerful and dynamic, instead of just explicitly telling us. So show, don't tell is really important for your narrative writing about this detective. So let's talk about unreliable narrators. Now, what is an unreliable narrator? Well, an unreliable narrator is a character who is not completely accurate or trustworthy due to their mental state or their maturity or their motivation. So there are 3 main types of unreliable narrator. We've got the guilty party. The narrator's actually trying to mislead us. They're not telling us the truth because they want to manipulate us somehow, and even manipulating other characters. You've got the insane narrator that actually is mad, and they are creepy, disturbing, grotesque aspects of that character that being revealed. But you may also have a narrator that is unreliable because of their maturity. They try to be sincere, they try to be consistent, but they don't have the experience, they're naive, or they don't have the information to give us a full picture. Now, for your year 8 story, your narrative that involves a detective, you may well want to use a narrator that is unreliable. So you may want to use a narrator that's actually a guilty party that the detective is trying to capture, one of the criminals that the detective is trying to solve a case around, and make them your main narrator. So that would give a very different slant on the story. We wouldn't believe everything that criminal says. Or you may show that the detective's state of mind is somehow jarred, and there are disturbing and grotesque aspects of that state of mind as he writes the narrative, or she writes the narrative. Or you might have an incredibly new detective who's very naive and very inexperienced and perhaps even gullible, telling a story that she thinks she's been, or he thinks they've been successful, but somehow there's no success and they don't understand until it's too late that they've been completely deceived. So maybe for this narrative, as a Year 8 student trying to write a story that includes a detective, you can think about using one of these unreliable narrators. Okay, for the last part of this webinar, let's think about the narrative arc. You would definitely have seen this. I think you would definitely have seen this. It may well have been called Story Mountain or something else. It's the narrative arc. And you can see that the story starts off on a plateau. We're just describing and introducing the characters, and things get more exciting, more difficult before they reach a peak and then become easier again. So you can see we don't start at the same place. There is a disequilibrium. That means there's a new normal by the end. There's been a change, a shift, a transition, and that's really clear for readers to see. And so something exciting and dramatic has changed the norm for the characters. So you would begin your narrative arc with a narrative hook. You want to grab the reader's attention at the beginning before you describe the setting or the characters and provide clues about what's there. You may even foreshadow, so give hints about what's going to happen. You might give a flashback, and all of this really is to build empathy with the main character. However, if you're using an unreliable narrator, you might not want to build empathy. You might want to build antipathy, which is hatred and dislike for the main character, because we don't trust them. We can see that they're unreliable. And so you're already giving those clues in the exposition. The rising action is when you include surprises and obstacles, complication, crisis, and confusion. Things get harder and more complicated as the action includes more twists and more conflict and more turns. And then the climax is that moment that really builds intensity. It might be a life-threatening moment. It might be a very difficult moral decision that's the turning point of the story. And then the falling action and the resolution is when we have finally some solutions. Things seem to be getting back to normal, but we would also include more problems. So there are added complications before you end strongly. So those are the 5 main aspects of the narrative arc. Well, what would that look like for your story that includes a detective? Well, for the first story, which is about the detective arresting a villain, perhaps we could start from the villain's perspective. Perhaps this is an unreliable narrator, and we can see that we can't trust everything they're saying because they're coming from a criminal perspective. So they might be alerting all units. Alert all units might be the beginning of the story, the narrative hook that gets our attention. So you would describe the detective and the assistant from the villain's viewpoint. It'd be very unfavorable, and how appalling and disgusting and useless they are. And then you would provide clues about what this villain's actually doing. They're planning a heist, and you might foreshadow the fact that it will be unsuccessful. It will end in an arrest. You might include a flashback about another confrontation, a different time that this villain had with the detective. So all of this is really to build that connection, which is antipathetic. So it's not empathy, it's antipathy with the villain. And then the rising action, you might include surprises. So as he enters or she enters the casino, they can't break the code. They've practiced it before. For some reason, it doesn't work. There might be complication that one of the crew, one of the villains, falls ill somehow. And there's this crisis where he's going to have to leave his colleague behind and just have to kind of deal with that later. And maybe there's confusion when they kind of leave the casino about what they stole and how much they stole and whether it was as successful as they had planned. And then the climax may well be this moment of intensity when he sees the detective. He understands now the detective was on their tail, and somehow this has all been an elaborate setup. That the confusion at the casino, not being able to break the code, and the other villain fallen sick and not really taking the amount they wanted, has been some kind of setup that's been involved with the detective, who's been able to crack the clues and get there before the villain. The falling action perhaps is some relief for the villain because more gang members arrive, but the problem is they are outnumbered by the detective and the detective force and the police force. And the strong ending is when the villain is finally arrested. So you can see in that story, you've used the narrative arc to make something that's engaging, that's entertaining. You've used indirect characterization by adding flashbacks and foreshadowing to show, not just to tell, about the hatred and the conflict between the villain and the detective. And then you also used the unreliable narrator. We can't really trust everything that the villain says to us because we know that their motivation isn't pure. What about another one that is more about making your readers disturbed, adding a sense of terror, adding a sense of fear? So you could, for example, start with congratulations. So that kind of gets our attention. What are we celebrating? Well, you can describe the detectives and the detectives team and provide clues that this has been a really successful case, that it's taken a while, they've been able to crack this case. And then you can start foreshadowing their next big case, the next big crime that they're trying to solve. And then perhaps you can have a flashback to the detective's cozy apartment before he gets there or she gets there, and really looking forward to a time where they can just put their feet up and relax after solving this big case and heading for the next big case to solve. However, obviously, with the rising actions, things aren't cozy in the department. You could include surprises. So as the detective returns to the apartment, the door is already open. And there are obstacles. When he tries to put on the light, it doesn't work. It remains dark. And there are complications. He's looking for his gun, but it's missing. And there's crisis and confusion because he can hear voices in the other room. So you're really trying to disturb and unsettle your readers. And then the climax is when he grabs his baseball bat, grabs his sledgehammer, goes from the bedroom into the living room, into the lounge to confront the burglar. But then the falling action is that actually some family members have organized a surprise party to celebrate the fact that he solved the case. But adding problems to the ending is that at the party is a suspect from the other crime that he's investigating, and his gun is still nowhere to be seen. So you end on that strong ending and that strong suspicion that something really unpleasant is happening in the flat, and it's involved this person who's infiltrated his family party. What about a story that is looking at prejudice? Well, for the narrative hook, you could describe a powerful, howling, swirling blizzard. So that kind of sense of cold and frost is also really symbolizing the cold and harsh environment that this detective has to deal with, and the prejudice that that detective has to face on a daily basis. So you can describe the treacherous setting, but also this contrasting partner, and really provide clues about racial differences. You could foreshadow a dangerous villain, but show that they're not a united front, and show perhaps a flashback about the selection process and how there were inequalities between how each of these detectives were chosen for this case. Perhaps one detective got in very easily because of his family, and the other one had to go through all sorts of different kind of processes, hoops and hurdles in order to be chosen. So you're really building empathy for the main character. And in rising action, you've got surprises. Maybe there are racist taunts from this unhelpful colleague, obstacles as they're trying to chase down this case. There's poor signal and technology fails them. Maybe there's a crisis of confidence, and there's confusion with the blizzard and the poor visibility. And the climax, perhaps, is that this colleague, this racist colleague, is attacked by the villain, And the detective, instead of going for the villain, is forced to let the villain go and to look after his colleague. So there's this kind of moral dilemma where he has to look after and protect and care for his colleague. And then the falling action, perhaps there are solutions. The racist colleague is much more respectful, but the villain is striking again, and maybe the detective is accused of misconduct. Despite saving his partner, they think it was his fault. So again, you end strongly with this idea of prejudice and injustice. Okay, I hope that has given you lots and lots of ideas about how you can write a story that involves a detective. I hope you think carefully about the purpose. I hope you think carefully about show, don't tell. I hope you have a go at including an unreliable narrator, and then think about the narrative arc in order to shape your story. I hope that's been helpful. Thank you for joining me.